Welcome back to the Most News in the Morning. Mexican drug lords aren't just bringing narcotics into the U.S. Police say that violent cartel clashes are actually spilling into the U.S. as well, and the problem's only getting worse. And that's heating up debate over the so-called war on drugs inside the Beltway. Our Jim Acosta is tracking this developing story for us from Washington. Good morning, Jim.
Good morning, Karen. With so much attention focused on the economy these days, the war on drugs was barely mentioned during the campaign, and now President Obama has some difficult decisions to make, just as a dramatic surge of violence is flaring up south of the border. After more than 6,000 people died of drug-related violence south of the border last year, there are fears that Mexico's narco war is headed north.
We've already begun to see drug-related violence and cartel violence in Phoenix. So this is something that I think you'll begin to see more and more reaching the interior of the United States.
Just before he took office, President Obama pledged to support Mexico's crackdown. But critics of the U.S. war on drugs argue it's time for a change in policy aimed at reducing demand.
Border violence in Mexico has not been this bad since the Mexican revolutions of 100 years ago. It's spilling over to the borders. It's very much a consequence of our failed prohibitionist policies. 3 former Latin American presidents recently wrote in the Wall Street Journal, the war on drugs has failed, and it's high time to replace an ineffective strategy with more humane and efficient drug policies.
Let's do what's smart.
During the campaign, Mr. Obama promised a new approach.
I think it's time we took a hard look at the wisdom of locking up some first-time nonviolent drug users for decades.
The White House says it wants to focus more on prevention and treatment and less on prison time. The administration is considering Seattle Police Chief Gil Kerlikowske a prevention advocate for the nation's next drug czar. The question is whether that means change for federal drug enforcement agents battling traffickers. A clash captured in the DEA's own reality TV show. And there are foreign policy implications. The Bush administration had promised $1 billion in aid to Mexico's army, an echo of U.S. support for Colombia's drug war. Opponents of the drug war ask, who's winning?
I don't like pot, but I hate the drug war, so I would repeal all the prohibitions. But I wouldn't even bother taxing it.
Changing drug policy, says one expert, is sort of like changing directions in an aircraft carrier. Slow is the key. For now, the administration is not talking about legalizing or decriminalizing drugs, something that would require the consent of Congress. Kieran, they just can't do that on their own.
Right. It's also interesting that we've been reporting this morning schools in Arizona, 3 big universities there where a lot of the kids enjoy spring break going down to Mexico. They're warning them that it's not safe. They want to rethink those travel plans.
Right. I think that's something that could be spreading to other universities across the country. As you mentioned earlier in the show, it is a rite of passage for college students to head down south of the border for their spring breaks. But the State Department, we should note, just over the weekend issued an updated travel warning for Mexico, telling Americans that you enter these border areas at your own risk. Not only are there these shootouts on the streets of many of these border towns, when these clashes occur with police and soldiers in Mexico, a lot of times Americans cannot leave the area on their own. They have to wait until the violence goes down. And so this is one of those situations where the State Department is saying you are going into these areas at your own risk.
Right. And it's important. And we're not talking about Cancun. We're talking about areas.
Right. Nuevo Laredo,
right.
Tijuana, exactly. These areas across the border. But, you know, if you're a college student, you know, at a university that's right across the border in the United States, a lot of times you can't afford to go down to Cancun. So spring break means going across the border and having some fun in those border towns. And what the United States government is now saying, the State Department is saying, is that is not as safe as it used to be.
Right. Or driving 22 hours straight in an old Volkswagen, but that's a different story.
Right. Kidnappings are a big problem in those interior sections of Mexico. And I know this is morning television, but they had 100 Mexican police chiefs beheaded last year in this country, which is why one of the experts we talked to yesterday mentioned there's a psychological aspect that's developing with the war on drugs in Mexico, and it's something that's starting to look like real war that we see in other parts of the world.
Very scary stuff. Jim Acosta for us this morning in Washington. Thank you. John?
We are monitoring breaking news this morning. North Korea says